Okay, so I think we've got everybody in from the waiting room now. So, good evening to everybody, and thank you for joining us this evening for this webinar. My name's Jane Wigan. I'm Events and Courses Officer at Sussex Wildlife Trust, and tonight I am joined by our Senior Land Advisor, Richard Black, who is going to tell us all about the fantastic Wilder Horsham District project. Just a little warning that poor Rich has got rather a croaky voice, so we're going to try and get through the webinar, but if his voice does begin to go, we'll just have to turn up our volumes. So before I hand over to him, I'm just going to go over a couple of housekeeping items. So this presentation will last for about 45 minutes, and then there'll be time for a short Q&A session at the end. And we hope to finish promptly at 7 p.m. this evening. So this session is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording to everybody via email once it's available. Your cameras and microphones are going to be switched off for the duration. So if you do have a question for Rich, this can be typed using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. At the end of this webinar, you'll be automatically redirected to our donations page on our website. If you were inspired by tonight's talk and would like to further support Sussex Wildlife Trust, then we would really welcome any donations. So now I'm going to hand you over to Rich Black, who is going to tell us all about the Wilder Horsham project. Thanks very much, Rich.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks very much for coming along this evening. I'm a little huskier this evening than I usually am, but hopefully you can all hear and understand me. So I'm going to talk to you.
Rich, sorry, could you turn your camera on? You've got
Oh,
your blanked out. Love to see your face.
sorry, schoolboy error.
That's all right.
Um, yeah, so I'm going to talk to you tonight about the Wilder Horsham District project, which is one of the landscape scale projects that we have in the Sussex Wildlife Trust. Um, what the Wildlife Horsham District project is a partnership project between Sussex Wildlife Trust and Horsham District Council. So myself and my colleagues, Steve Tillman and Louisa Jones, who are the project officers, are employed by Sussex Wildlife Trust, but much of our funding comes from Horsham District Council, and we work closely with the District Council on all phases of the project. We have a project logo, which is, as you can see, roughly in the shape of Horsham District. It is green and blue to represent the Trust and the District Council, the primary colours of those two organisations. And it has a variety of habitats on it to show that we are a landscape scale project concerned with species and habitat recovery. And the project was really set up because of the biodiversity crisis. I'm sure you're all aware of the biodiversity crisis, that we are one of the most nature depleted countries in the world in the UK, and that we are part of a general global decline in species. We're in the middle of potentially in the middle of another mass extinction. And this is not just a global problem. Obviously, it's a local problem as well. In Sussex, we have lost 80%, for example, of our wetlands damaged or destroyed. We've lost 97% of our chalk grassland. Water voles have declined in over 90% in the last 30 years. And our woodlands are riddled with invasive species, resulting in reduced biodiversity. These are just a few examples, but you can pick out any number of others. So, the Wilder Horsham District project is a partnership, as I said, between Horsham District Council and Sussex Wildlife Trust, and it's really the council's drive to try and reverse the biodiversity crisis on a local level, at a district level. It's based on nature recovery networks and wildlife corridors. So back in 2010, the government commissioned a review by Sir John Lawton to look at what needed to be done within the country to reverse biodiversity declines. And they came up with what known as the Lawton principles, which can be summarized as bigger, better, more, and joined up. And that's represented by this diagram here. So these green blobs are the bits of good habitat, but those good habitats need to be better. They need to be bigger, as represented by these green buffers here. There need to be more of them, as represented by this big brown blob up here. That's a new area created. And critically, they need to be joined up, um, either by corridors or by stepping stones, so that wildlife has the shortest distance to jump. Because one of the big causes of biodiversity, one of the big reasons for biodiversity decline, is it is becoming increasingly difficult, especially in built-up countries like the UK, for wildlife to move. We have some really good wildlife habitats in Sussex and in the United Kingdom, but many of them are isolated. So Sussex Wildlife Trust have a number of nature reserves. Most of them, we hope, are pretty well managed. Um, but they're often surrounded by relatively unfriendly areas of land. So obviously, towns and cities, roads, that kind of built infrastructure can be difficult for wildlife to cross. But surprisingly, so can a lot of our green fields. Um, some wildlife has very specific movement criteria, and as an example of that, um, this is showing the movement of Bechstein and Barbastelle bats. So Bechstein and Barbastelle are woodland bats. They can fly, but they're very, very reluctant to fly across open ground. They really only will fly under canopy. So if you can imagine in this picture, that the roosting grounds of the bats are at the bottom of the picture, and this area at the top is the feeding grounds. You can see that you only need to lose a couple of small shaves of woodland to completely separate, to effectively separate the breeding grounds from the roosting, the feeding grounds from the roosting grounds, and make this landscape impenetrable to the bats. And that's what nature recovery networks are about. It's about giving animals and plants, species, corridors to move across the landscape, to give them the requirements that they need to do so. And of course, different species have different requirements. So whereas Bechstein barbastelle bats won't move except under tree canopy, there are many species of butterflies that don't like to move under tree canopy. They need open spaces. So really a nature recovery network is an attempt to map all these different habitat and movement requirements of different species on top of each other. It can be quite complicated. So how do you set about building a nature recovery network? Well, one of the first things that we did when the project started 5 years ago was to try and map what a nature recovery network might look like for Horsham District. So we started with the rivers. Here's Horsham District, and we have sort of three major river systems that are part of Horsham District. You've got the on the east side, you've got the Ada River coming up, and then the tributaries coming across the middle of the district. On the west side, the district is mostly bounded by the Arun, and then tributaries of the Arun come across the northern district. And there's a bit of a mole catchment right up in the northeast corner. And rivers are really important. Wet habitats are incredibly important for biodiversity. Lots of insects require water as part of their biodiversity, as part of their life cycle. And insects really are the bedrock of many ecosystems. And of course, rivers are natural corridors. You know, they're a natural way for species to move across the landscape. So we started with the rivers. Many of our wetlands, as I mentioned earlier, have disappeared. So kind of concentrating and increasing those habitats and making it really make sense. Then we're lucky enough to work with the Biodiversity Record Centre at Sussex Wildlife Trust, and they have a lot of data. So thinking about what those core sites might be that the Lawton principles talk about. So you've got the triple SIs, you've got the local wildlife sites, and you've got the sort of the rare and unusual habitats within the district. So that includes stuff like acid grassland in purple and heathland. This dark green is gill woodland, and then down at the bottom of the district where the downs are, you've got a lot of chalk downland. And these are rare habitats that are particularly important because they hold rare or unusual species. So chalk downland, for example, is one of Europe's richest and most diverse habitats. Some people kind of describe it as being England's rainforest because you can have up to 45 different plants within a single meter of chalk grassland. And that diversity supports a huge range of specialist insects and wildlife. For example, about 60% of the UK's butterfly species are found on chalk grassland. And it's the thin, impoverished soils of chalk grassland that create that high diversity. So when you put those designated sites, those local wildlife sites and assets at risk on a map, that gives you your core sites. And then adding to that, you can put in your nature reserves. So there's some Sussex Wildlife Trust nature reserves within Horsham District. Horsham District themselves have land holdings, and then right in the middle of the district is NEP. I'm sure many of you are familiar with NEP, the big rewilding project in Horsham District and Sussex. And a NEP is important for two reasons, I suppose, in this particular map. It's right in the centre of the district, as you can see. So nodally, it's quite important. But also, the NEP have shown that you can that anywhere can become an area of biodiversity interest. So if this map had been produced 20 years ago before NEP started their rewilding project, maybe it wouldn't have appeared on the map at all. But what NEP have done goes to show that there is biodiversity potential anywhere if you get the habitat management right. And then there's other data within the biodiversity record centre that we were able to use. So this is looking at different habitat types across the district that we were able to put into our map. The red blobs are ancient and veteran trees, and you can see that kind of NEP pops out as a big red blob in the middle of the map. And that's actually probably not because NEP has more veteran trees than anywhere else. But because it has such a good recording effort. So I think that's another lesson to take away from tonight is perhaps the more recording you do, the more records that get sent into the Biodiversity Record Centre, the better information we have and the more we can do to help wildlife. We were fortunate as well in the district that there had been some habitat potential mapping done, looking at where habitats could be restored and improved. So this was work done by Natural England in combination with the South Downs National Park and others. Unsurprisingly, a lot of that habitat potential and areas for potential improvement is along the river corridors, but also there are opportunities for heathland restoration, for chalk grassland restoration, for improving wet woodland and floodplain woodland. So that data all goes on the map as well. And then you think about buffering, that's that bigger and better part of the Lawton principles, trying to increase the size of those important areas for wildlife. And then the final piece is the connectivity. How do you join those up? And that's kind of one of the things that we're trying to do as part of the Wild Horsham District project. Not only improve those good areas that are good for biodiversity or have high biodiversity potential, but work out how we can join them up. And as I said, there is potential for improvement. There's potential for anywhere to be part of that network. And as part of that nature recovery network, you're really looking at trying to create about 30% of the land as being suitable for nature and for biodiversity. That famous 30 by 30 tagline. The idea is to get 30% of the country, and thereby by extension of both Sussex and Horsham District, in favourable condition for wildlife in these kind of nature recovery networks by 2030, which is not that far away. So the clock is ticking, and projects like this are really important in helping to do that. So what we're looking at essentially is trying to turn what is often a quite is sort of represented by the diagram on the screen at the moment, trying to turn a quite simple and bland landscape with open fields and monocultures into something a bit more diverse, smaller fields, more river features, more wetland features, more habitat types and variety, more scrub, those kind of things. So how's the Wild Horsham District trying to do that? Well, the project has three different project strands: organizational resilience, landscape resilience, and community resilience. So the first of these organizational resilience is the organization concerned here is Horsham District Council itself. And one of the main principles of the project has been to try and embed the principles of the project, the principles of nature recovery throughout the council, so that it's first and foremost in thinking of everything they do. So we've engaged in a program of staff talks and career development plans around these issues of nature recovery and biodiversity loss. We've engaged with the planning department to help review plans and policies and input into the local plan, and indeed the our nature recovery network, which you can read in its full version on the Sussex Wildlife Trust website, has been included as part of the local new version of the local plan when it does go forward. We engage with members of the council, and we work very closely with the Parks and Countryside team who manage the Horsham District Council land holdings. So through the Parks and Countryside team, we've helped them kind of work out a grounds maintenance review, looking at how they maintain their estate. They do volunteering. They've had a grazing review, looking at how the conservation grazing on their land works. They support No Mow May, and as I mentioned, the Horsham District Council land holdings are part of that nature recovery network that we are building up as part of the district. Landscape resilience is really the core of the project. That's about how we change habitats and improve connectivity for species across the district. And then a major part of that, and a major part of my job, is land advice visits. So I spend a lot of time going out, talking to landowners, discussing and advising them on how land can be improved for wildlife, and what mechanisms can be used to achieve that. The partnership is very big the project is very big on partnership working, and we work with a lot of colleagues for example, Tara Dawson there from the Native Rivers Trust, Sophie Brown from the South Downs National Park. We work with Horsham District Council staff, of course, and we work with the Lost Woods, the Low Wheel project, among others. So there really is a lot of things that we can do together, and by working in partnership, we can achieve more than we can any one group could individually. There's quite a lot going on within the district, of course. So there is we are part of the South Downs National Park, obviously passes through the district. We work with them. The Higher Weald OA&B or other national landscape, as they're now called, comes into the northeast of the district. We work with two farm clusters: the Arran to Ada farm cluster down here in the south, and the Upper Ada farm cluster. This is the grey hatching in the middle there. And there are various other projects that we're working with as well. So one of those is the Ada River Recovery Project, which is one of the parts of the new stewardship scheme being introduced by the government. That is 47 land holdings, I think. Sorry, 27 land holdings, I mean, up the River Ada, and we are currently just finished the initial setup phase of that project, and we're waiting to hear from the government how the next stage will work. The project has funding itself, so provided through Horsham District Council. We have a Nature Recovery Award, which landowners or community groups can apply for projects that will improve habitat or habitat quality. So applications for that are awarded quarterly, up to £5,000 per project, and we have so far awarded over £130,000 to 51 different projects over the course of the Wild Horsham District project lifespan. And the other thing we do is volunteer work parties. So we run I think about 100 volunteers on our books at the moment, specifically for our project. The Sussex Wildlife Trust, of course, as a whole has more. And we go out and we help on landholdings with all kinds of conservation work. So that includes head tree planting and hedge laying. I'll cover a few more of those things later on in the talk. Um, One of the main drivers of the project and what we're aiming to do is to restore natural processes. So um, are the species that are native to the UK grew evolved in a world without humans. They evolved in a world that was driven by natural processes. Um, and at a fundamental level, it was driven by the interaction between um, animals, particularly grazing animals, um, and the vegetation trying to regrow. So that's what we mean by natural processes. And one of the processes, perhaps possibly arguably the most important that we're trying to restore is natural flood management. So we have spent a lot of time as a society straightening rivers, building ditches, building land drains, spending a lot of time and effort to get the water off the land as quickly as possible. And the result is that we now have floods downstream and droughts upstream. Our water quality is very poor. I mean, there are only a handful of rivers in the UK that pass any kind of water quality test. Um, and so changing how water moves across the landscape is incredibly important for biodiversity as well as for climate change and for human comfort as well. So this is a picture of a place called a farm called Maze Park, which is one we're working with. And as part of the Nature Recovery Award, we help pay for the removal of land drains. So, as I mentioned, sort of land drains are riddled throughout the Sussex countryside. In some places, you can find kind of an old clay land drain next to a kind of post-war concrete land drain, next to a plastic land drain where people have just put in more land drains without taking out the old ones, and that is just taking the water off the land too quickly. One of the main principles of natural flood management is trying to slow the flow, trying to kind of stop the water rushing off the land as quickly as it does. And so here at Mace Park, by breaking up the land drains, we've created, as you can see, a series of pools, which are not only really good for wildlife, but they're actually really good for the cattle. So the cattle now use these in preference to the water troughs for drinking. And of course, they use them for bathing, and that kind of thing as well. So um, really, really good project there. We've also done some work creating a lot of ponds and scrapes, again, to hold water back on the land so that it isn't all rushing off so quickly. So this is a wood in Rusper, where on our advice the landowner built a woodland pond, and woodland ponds have their own special groups of ecological group set of ecological niches. So shaded ponds will support slightly different species than open ponds, and often it's a good idea to have both shade and open areas in your pond for that reason. So as well as new ponds, we've funded pond restoration. So believe it or not, this is a former pond. That was what it looked like, but now it looks, well, this is what it looked like immediately after restoration. Hopefully it's a bit more vegetated by now. But again, it's all about that water restoration. And this is another thing we do, particularly with volunteer groups, is learning to be beavers. So these are leaky dams. And leaky dams kind of do exactly what they say on the tin. They're dams, but they're a little bit leaky. So they slow the water down. They create pools. They re-wet areas behind them, but they don't stop the water entirely. They don't stop the flow. The flow keeps going, and these create all kinds of benefits. So they obviously they create more wet areas, as I mentioned earlier. Well, wet is really important for lots of wildlife, so they create really good wildlife habitat. But they also, by slowing the flow, they stop droughts downstream. They retain water upstream, so they prevent droughts down. They just prevent droughts, stop droughts upstream and flooding downstream, and also they act as water purification devices and as carbon storage. So they have lots and lots of benefits, these leaky dams, and of course, a great fun to do as well. And volunteer work parties really love kind of getting in amongst the ditches and making these leaky dams. But of course, we don't do them as well as these guys. And you know, one of the things that we've heard recently is that beavers are going to be now allowed to have catchment releases in the UK. This is really exciting. So beavers are one of those keystone species whose impact on the landscape is very beneficial for other species as well as, you know, potentially for humans. And so the news that there will be catchment scale releases in Sussex rivers is very exciting. Of course, there are potential concerns as well with beavers, but in every country where beavers have been restored, the overall net effect has been extremely positive, and that's true in Pearson, in the UK as well. The River Otter now they have beavers, and although as I mentioned, there can be issues with beavers, you know, taking down trees that people don't want them to take down, or building dams in inappropriate places. All of those problems have a solution. And one of the key parts of the releasing of beavers in the UK will be that there will be a management plan in place to deal with any problems that arise, that up to including moving problem beavers to a different location if that's required. Um, I personally think that bringing a highly healthy population of beavers back is probably the single biggest thing we could do to reverse biodiversity declines and the climate crisis within the district because of all the benefits they have. We do already have some beavers in Sussex, as you may know. There are beavers at Knepp, so we will wait and see how that develops. Another natural process that we are interested in is natural succession, and that's about how plants repopulate areas. So one of the things that we find in the modern world a lot of the time is that the habitats are static. So a heathland stays a heathland, a woodland stays a woodland, a field stays a field. But that would not have been the case in the past. In the past, there would have been a constant battle between the vegetation trying to grow back and animals trying to eat it. And that battle between animals and vegetation, created the habitats that our UK species lived in. So the idea that at one time a squirrel could have run to John O'Groats to Land's End is no longer no longer the prevailing understanding. So it may be true, but it would have had to take a very circuitous route. So probably back in primeval times, the UK would have been about a third woodland, about a third open land, and about a third scrubland. And scrub is actually a very important and very underrated habitat. So many species require scrub or some element of scrub as part of their life cycle. And scrub is probably the biggest missing component in a lot of our Sussex habitats, particularly because we have a very heavy deer pressure in a lot of areas, which means, you know, you're going to a Sussex woodland and there'll be almost no understory. So restoring natural succession, effectively restoring scrub, and restoring the battle between, or evening up, if you like, the battle between the grazing animals and the vegetation is a key principle of the project. So an example of this is a site I've been working at over in Rackham, where they were trying to do some heathland restoration, but the problem was that the deer pressure was so high that the heathland was just getting browsed out. So as part of the Nature Recovery Award, we paid for the fence, which you can just see in the background there, and the result was a big change. So now they've got gorse restoring, they've got heather coming back as well. In fact, it's been so successful that we've had to take some work parties back and pretend to be deer and take out some of the vegetation, particularly the pine and birch regrowth, which we don't want on a heathland. So you do so, and sometimes we always say and we always recommend that if possible, you know, revegetating should happen naturally. So natural succession is what we would like to see. Because if you plant trees on a field, you don't really have a woodland. You've got trees on a field. Because when you plant trees, you don't get with that planting, you don't get the kind of the natural flora and fauna that comes into the soil in a woodland. Whereas if you let things go through succession, then those things it goes more slowly, but every stage of that process is useful is valuable for wildlife, and things kind of find their own way back in and develop together. Sometimes, however, you do need to give succession a helping hand, and that might be where there isn't a nearby seed source, or where particular species are not likely to recover to recolonize naturally. So a good example of that is black poplar, which is a very rare native tree. Was once down to only about 30 or so individuals in the whole of Sussex. So the Sussex Wildlife Trust have been involved in a project doing black poplar planting. Really nice tree, and grows into a magnificent adult when mature. Uh, so so some specific planting is sometimes necessary to help things along. But if you do that, it's really important, as Sue is demonstrating here, to free the trees at the end. Don't leave the tree guards on. I personally I'm not a big fan of tree guards. Too often they get put on and they get left on, and they end up not only kind of restricting the growth of the tree, so the tree goes very tall and thin instead of growing nice and bushy as you'd like to see, which creates more niches for wildlife. Instead it goes tall and thin, and actually, although the guards are supposed to split, they often end up damaging the tree as well. And then if they're not taken off, they will break up, and you end up with microplastics in the environment. So while it is necessary sometimes to use them to give trees a bit of a start, we would prefer to use fencing to exclude animals, or it increasingly, because actually the tree guard itself is one of the most expensive bits of the planting process. So you can often plant two or even three extra trees for the cost of the tree guard, which if your deer pressure is not too high, means that if you plant in that higher density, you're probably going to get enough young trees away to make your planting worthwhile. And furthermore, actually, if the ground browsing pressure isn't too high, a browse bush or shrub is a more interesting plant from a wildlife point of view than one that grows straight in a tree tube, because those when those shrubs are browsed, typically what happens is the leader gets nipped off, and so they grow into a much denser, more twisted, more tangled shapes, which has more value for wildlife. And thorny plants like hawthorn or blackthorn will throw out more thorns in response to browsing pressure, which makes them better breeding habitat for nesting habitat for birds and things like that, more protective for smaller species. So that naturalistic grazing is the third of the kind of the big natural processes that we are trying to promote through the project. And I've covered a bit of it already, but that interaction between the 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 grazing animals and the undergrowth is what creates a lot of the different niches that UK species need. Insects and birds and mammals are driven by these keystone species that are shaping the landscape. And cattle are a classic one, but different animals affect the landscape in different ways. So cattle, for example, are feed by wrapping their tongue around vegetation and ripping it up, and that creates more of a mosaic pattern than something like a horse or a sheep that when it crops the ground will crop it very close. But wild type horses will tackle vegetation that cattle won't. They'll go for really tough browse. So Um, the key is having, as it would have been in the past, having different males doing different jobs in the landscape, and that creates the biggest variety of habitats. Uh, uh, so that includes deer as well, um, of course. Sorry, but so naturalistic grazing, as I said, is one of those natural processes we're seeking to restore. It's effectively that's what they're doing at Knepp, which is where this picture is from. This is a longhorn cattle at Knepp, and those longhorn cattle are supposed to kind of representing, if you like, the wild aurochs of the past. The horses they have at Knepp are representing the wild ponies that used to gallop across the UK. They have deer there representing the deer, and Tamworth pigs there as a surrogate for wild boar. So they're trying to get that thing of different males, different impacts of different species affecting the landscape in different ways. But one thing they don't have, of course, is predation. And one thing, and another thing they can't replicate is the migratory movements. So the our wild herd of animals, just as wildebeest and things do in Africa today, would once have moved across the landscape in response to conditions and seasons. So it would be very likely, for example, that it was if it was when it was very wet and there were lots of biting insects. Animals might have actually migrated en masse up onto the downs where it was drier and where there might be fewer insects. Some of those movements are lost in the mist of time, and we can only guess at what they were. So they're very hard to replicate. But it's something that it is missing from our current landscape, that ability for animals to move across the landscape. And potentially that is something that could happen with nature recovery networks and wildlife corridors in the future. It might be possible to allow some of those big movements of animals across the landscape. The other thing that we are lacking somewhat, as I mentioned, is dynamism in the landscape. So, as I said, kind of very often these days a woodland stays a woodland, a field stays a field. But in the past, there would have been a constantly shifting mosaic as the battle between grazing animals and livestock waxed and waned, and animal and vegetation took over in some places, whereas animals won in others. And that would have been a constant flux. And that flux itself is an important aspect that we're missing, and which potentially with the nature recovery network, you could start to recover some of that as well. The other big thing, of course, that's missing is predation, because animals behave very differently in situation where they're a threat of predation than in places where they don't. Where deer are worried about being jumped on by a lynx or chased by a pack of wolves, they don't tend to hang around in one place. They'll keep moving on, so that they don't present themselves as a sitting target. Um, Whereas in the UK, a group of fallow deer will happily sit around in one area, munch it to blazes before moving on to the next area and munching that to blazes too. So one thing that you can do to try and replicate some of these herd movements, both in response to predators and in response to the seasons, is what's called mob grazing. So this is on a farm that we're working with, the Involved Farm, where they use mob grazing. And mob grazing is a method of putting, where you put a relatively large number of cows into quite a small area, but you move them on regularly. So that's doing several things. So it's replicating that kind of movement of the natural movement of herds, where they would be constantly moving through the environment, and that has quite a lot of benefits. For one thing, it means that over a, a any given area, you're getting more value typically out of your land, because you're allowing the grass to grow back. And if an animal's moved, depending on the system, an animal might not come back to to an area that it's grazed for 30 to 90 days. And what that does is it gives the grass a chance to go through its life cycle, and that can increase grass productivity by up to 30% and significantly improve soil quality. Um, which is beneficial for the animals. It also means the animals are constantly being moved away from their dung, so it breaks the cycle of the parasites. Whereas in the standard set stocking system that most places use in the UK, those animals are kind of in proximity to their own dung for a long period of time. This is one of a series of, so mob grazing is one of a series of techniques of which are being known as regenerative agriculture, which is really in many cases just kind of going back to how farming used to be done before the chemical and mechanical revolution in farming, when machines and fertilizers and insecticides and things really became prevalent after the Second World War. Um, and many of those kind of regenerative practices going back to the techniques of the past are better for the landscape than the modern ones. Um, Other things that those animals did, of course, was to create other kinds of habitat. So cattle in particular, horned cattle using trees to rub up against and knocking bushes over. Horned cattle are better at this than pole cattle. It helps to create deadwood, and deadwood is really the bedrock of the ecosystem, for many species, really important. So deadwood creation is something that you can do, as a land manager. Of course, you can use cattle will do it, but you can also use a chainsaw to go and create some deadwood as well. And sometimes that's what we have to do when we're looking at creating habitats. Sometimes it's, ideally you can get animals to do it. In some cases, on a small land holding or somewhere you can't easily get animals in, you can go and do it. And you as a land manager or as a volunteer group can effectively go and mimic a cow, just as you mimic a beaver when you're building a leaky dam. Similarly, haloing trees. So in the modern modern forestry, trees are often very planted close together, so they'll go tall and straight. But that means that they have very tight canopies, and actually that creates that reduces the number of available niches. What an open grown tree, a tree with big spreading branches, has many more niches and opportunities. It's much better for wildlife value. So one of the things we've done with volunteers is doing a bit of haloing trees. Typically, we'll go out with chainsaws, do a bit of haloing, and then the work party will come in afterwards and do the clear up. So this is a clear up work party, haloing after haloing some trees. And scrub, as I mentioned, is really important. Hedges, for a long time in the UK, hedges were effectively a proxy for scrub. They were filling the gap that would have been left without scrub. So again, post Second World War, when barbed wire came in, lots of hedges were grubbed out and replaced with wire fences. Whereas the traditional method of keeping stock in was hedge laying and planting. And so that's one of the things that we do again with the project. So we're trying to get out there, and we're out with the National Trust last week laying a big hedge with a group of volunteers. So that has lots of benefits. Obviously, it does if you lay it properly, it makes it stock proof. So you don't need to use a barbed wire fence. But it also has lots of benefit for wildlife, because the real value for wildlife in a hedge, sorry, is when it's thick and dense at the bottom of the hedge, and if you just manage a hedge by, as they so often done now, by topping and cutting the sides, you end up with tall, leggy hedges, which are not very good for wildlife. Hedge laying can restore hedges, and this tool here it's called a beaver, or beetle. And it's a traditional hedge laying tool. It's made from holly, and you use it to bash in the stakes to hold the hedge together and make it stock proof. Another species I mentioned is pigs, and pigs are a really important keystone species. We definitely could do with more pigs in the UK, get out there, particularly some of these wild types. And as with all these conservation grazing animals, the closer they are to the wild types, the better, because they tend to be better at managing tough vegetation. and they're more hardy. You can leave them out over the year, but pigs, particularly through their rootling, as shown here, are create loads of niches for other wildlife species. They really are the bacon flavored bulldozers. They just charge through through the ground, turn it over, and that creates niches for um, annual plants to flower, and for the insects that are associated with those plants. There are a lot of things like butterflies love open ground for basking on, and all that can be created by pigs. They're also very good at controlling things that have become invasive in their absence. So bracken is a big problem in lots of places. Well, in the past, it would have been wild boar who rootled down and dealt with the bracken. Um, Invasives are, of course, a big problem in the UK, and habitat improvement by subtraction is something else that is really important within the nature recovery network. So this is Himalayan balsam, which is we're removing with a volunteer group. That's obviously from the Himalayas. It's a plant that swamps areas. It isn't really handled. It isn't really eaten by very many UK species. Some bees will eat it, but even that's a bit of a problem because it means that the bees are nectaring on the Himalayan balsam and ignoring therefore failing to pollinate native plants. It's kind of like candy for them, so it's not good for them, but they like it. Um, Other invasives like bamboo often requires contractors rather than volunteers, and of course there's rhododendron, which is a possibly the worst invasive plant we have in the UK. Um, it's used by almost no UK species. Black caps will occasionally nest in it, but no other birds really use it. No insects feed on it, and the flowers are poisonous to most British bees. And even it poisons the ground underneath it, acidifies the ground. So even after you've taken away, often it still takes some time for it to restore. So definitely one that's good to remove. The particular problem is Rhododendron ponticum, which is the invasive species that really spreads through our woodlands. There are other rhododendron species in the UK that are used as ornamental plants, but they're not nearly so invasive. They don't do much good for wildlife, but they don't swamp play areas like ponticum does. Himalayan balsam, I should mention that actually beavers quite like eating it, so that's another problem they could help with. Community resilience is the final strand of the project, and that's really about engaging with people, because none of this happens without the cooperation and the input of the public, and whether that's landowners or just any householder can do something to help with the nature recovery network. So community resilience is about linking communities to green spaces and building networks for wildlife. So as part of that, the project works with parish councils. So that map shows the parish councils within Horsham District and the ones we've engaged with to date. Um, Various ones we've worked with. We've done some work with Swift, particularly with Swift Swallow and House Martin boxes. So helping community groups to put up boxes for these species. So these are all species that have limitations in the availability of nest sites. So kind of putting up boxes can really make a difference to them. A good example of a group we're working with is Wild About Warnham. So this is a sort of from Warnham Parish. This is a local group, and they're doing a lot of things that kind of help with nature recovery networks. There is a lot that can be done in your local community as well. And of course, as an individual, there's a huge amount you can do. And part of the project is giving advice to individuals, whether that be for something as simple as a garden or a big estate. So as an example, how we had a chap contact us a while back and said, I'd really like to do something in my garden to improve wildlife. So I sent him a list of suggestions, and he rang me back a few months later saying, I've done it all. What do I do next? So he's put in a wildflower meadow. He's put in a native hedge. He's put in deadwood, a pond. and groups of native species. And anybody can do that kind of thing and really improve wildlife in their own place. So urban areas are very important for certain species, such as hedgehogs and toads, that are declining in woodland areas. Possibly the best thing you can do in your garden is to put in a pond. Just add some water, any kind of water, even a bird bath can make a difference. Water, is, again, comes back to the thing, water being so important for wildlife. Reinvent your lawn. Take a mow less often. Bees like areas with lots of the same flowers where they can pop quickly from one flower to the next. So just by mowing less often, buttercups, daisies, and moss happily coexist with grass on your lawn. And areas of short grass create feeding areas for birds. One of the best maxims for any kind of wildlife management is don't do everything the same and don't do it all at the same time. So leave areas that are longer, leave areas that are shorter. Take the next step and one step further, and create a garden meadow, sowing in a meadow of perennial flowers and grasses, somewhere where you've got the full sun. And get connected. Most species are highly mobile, and that's what the nature recovery networks are all about. They need to move around to find food, mates, and nest sites. This is a bird eye view of a typical street, and it shows how a bird or butterfly views the landscape. They don't care about fences, but things like hedgehogs do. And this is a map showing how a hedgehog moves through the garden. Not like uses different gardens as part of its territory, but it can't do that unless it can get through into different gardens. So creating spaces to allow hedgehogs to pass through is another really good thing that you can do. And of course, planting a hedge or alongside a fence is another great opportunity. You can do that in your garden just as well as in a field, and that creates a corridor for wildlife. And going peat free perhaps is one of the most important things you can do. And peat is really, really damaging. The use of peat fertilizers is destroying our peat bogs and wet heathlands. And peat is incredibly important as a carbon sink, as well as a wildlife habitat. So going peat free in your garden is another thing that you can really easily do to improve things. And of course, as I mentioned earlier, please record what you see. The more information we have about what's out there in Sussex, the more we can do to help it. So iRecord is really useful as an app. If you haven't got it, please pop it on your phone, or send in your records to the Sussex Biodiversity Record Centre. And please do have a look at our website, Wild Horsham District on Sussex Wildlife Trust. We've got blogs and all kinds of bits and pieces of information on there so that you can read about what we do.